Welcome to one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're curious to see which places and what times of day or night these accounts reach. In the spring of 1851, a portrait of a young man was discovered in the attic of the Pembroke House, one of Charleston's oldest and most prominent historical mansions. The painting showed a smiling young man seated with a confidence that seemed carefully constructed, dressed in formal attire not commonly associated with anyone of his presumed origin. What captured the attention of the Charleston Heritage Society wasn't the skill of the painting, though it was remarkable, but a faint inscription hidden along the lower right edge of the canvas. Jonas Booker, property of the Ashford Plantation. That single line would unravel a history the city spent more than a century avoiding. The portrait itself appeared ordinary at first glance. Oil on canvas, roughly 18 by 22 inches, depicting a young black man with an unusually controlled smile. His eyes, though, seemed to follow anyone who stepped into the room, an effect sometimes achieved by highly skilled portrait artists. What made this painting especially strange was the fact that enslaved individuals were almost never painted in formal portraiture during the antebellum period, certainly not with the dignity or attention afforded to this particular subject. According to records from the Charleston Heritage Society, the portrait was initially catalogued simply as Portrait of Unknown Young Man and stored among dozens of other artifacts recovered from plantation homes around Charleston, Johns Island, and the surrounding Low Country. For over 20 years, it gathered dust. It wasn't until 1872, more than 2 decades after the portrait's discovery, that anyone took particular interest in it. A researcher named Henry Caldwell, known for documenting Charleston's architectural evolution, noticed the painting when photographing items for an upcoming preservation catalog. Caldwell's journal entries, found in 1964 during a renovation of the South Carolina Historical Archives, describe the moment he first paused in front of the painting. He wrote, "The young man's eyes possess an unusual depth, not quite sorrow, not quite resignation, but something else, a guarded calculation, perhaps. The expression of someone who has measured the room long before the viewer arrives." That observation compelled Caldwell to visit the former Ashford Plantation, located 10 miles northwest of Charleston, along a stretch of land that once bordered the Ashley River. By the 1870s, the plantation had been sold multiple times, its wealth evaporated during the Civil War. The once grand Ashford family, having lost most of their fortune, left few descendants and even fewer records. Caldwell was granted access to a deteriorating outbuilding that had once housed the plantation's overseer. Inside, he discovered crumbling ledgers, correspondence, and household inventories. But the most important find lay tucked in a drawer beneath a stack of moldy tax receipts. A small leather-bound ledger, no title on the cover, ink faded but still legible. Within its pages were detailed records of every enslaved person owned by the Ashford family, each name accompanied by age, parentage, skill level, and market value. On page 42, Caldwell found the first written documentation of the young man in the portrait, Jonas Booker. Male, age 22, born on property to Leela, deceased, literate beyond standard instruction, high aptitude for figures, experiment shows strong results, potential value $900. The phrase "experiment shows strong results" troubled Caldwell. Teaching enslaved individuals to read or handle numbers was uncommon and often illegal. Another entry, dated September 3, 1849, noted, J.B. continues to outperform expectations, maintains secondary ledgers with precision and minimal oversight, exceptional memory for transactions, experiment appears worthwhile. That was followed by a note from December 12th. Concerns regarding J.B.'s inquisitiveness, asked questions about his mother's death and circumstances. Ashford suggests reducing scope of lessons and reminding him of his station. Caldwell might have stopped his research there, but during his fourth visit to the former Ashford plantation, he encountered an elderly woman named Ruby Harlan, who had worked as a house servant when she was a child. According to Caldwell's notes, Ruby remembered Jonas clearly. Her recorded account provides the first detailed description of the man behind the painted smile. Mr. Jonas wasn't like the others, Ruby told him. Mr. Ashford brought him into the big house after Miss Leela passed, said the boy had an unusual way of watching people, taught him numbers, letters, even let him handle the books. That wasn't something done in those days, but Mr. Ashford liked to show him off, like he was a trick pony that could count better than the white men he invited to dinner. Ruby described how Jonas could calculate sums faster than most educated clerks in Charleston. Ashford used this talent as entertainment, placing Jonas at the head of the table to dazzle visiting planters. He'd smile for them, that same strange smile from the painting. But the minute they left, that smile would disappear. His eyes would go sharp again, like he was adding something up they didn't understand. Ruby went on to explain that Ashford commissioned the portrait in early 1851 after months of forcing Jonas to practice that smile. Said he wanted the painter to capture Jonas at his best. Jonas held that smile for hours, but at night he'd whispered to himself in the room off the pantry, numbers, names, things I didn't know. The portrait was finished in March of that year and displayed in Ashford's study, but the months that followed turned the painting into a relic of something far darker. In August 1851, Ashford reported Jonas as having escaped, posting a notice in the Charleston Courier, "Runaway enslaved man, literate, skilled with figures, may attempt to forge documents. Answers to Jonas. Reward $150. The notice ran for 2 weeks, then stopped. Jonas was never reported captured. But Ashford's own diary, a ledger bound in cracked red leather found later in the overseer's cottage, tells a different story. And that is where things begin to turn.
Ashford's personal diary, which Caldwell recovered beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the overseer's quarters, begins to reveal a version of events far more disturbing than any runaway report printed in the Charleston Courier. The entry dated August 14, 1851, 2 days before the first newspaper notice, reads, "J did not flee as publicly stated. Fabrication necessary after discovery of his private writings. Contents not suitable for record. Have confined him to the old storm cellar while considering appropriate measures. Ruby instructed to spread word of escape." The entry is written with forceful pen strokes, as though Ashford had pressed the quill harder than usual. A later entry, dated August 19th, shifts from anger to something resembling fear. Jay's confinement continues, shows no remorse, insists that his figures were correct. The secret ledgers he kept in the pantry room detail discrepancies extending back nearly 3 years. Funds misallocated, entries falsified, sums diverted, extent unknown. More concerning are his writings about the household, observations of myself, family, visitors, detailed, precise. When questioned, he smiles. Same smile as in the portrait. Disturbs me greatly. Ashford's diary entries grow increasingly frantic. He writes of sleepless nights, phantom footsteps,
and an odd sensation that the home's ledgers, those Jonas had handled, no longer added up the same way. On September 1st, he recorded, "Servants claimed to see Jay inside the house after nightfall. Impossible. The cellar door remains sealed, yet new entries appear in the ledgers in his hand. Must inspect locks, cannot trust help." The next entry, written 7 days later, contains a chilling conclusion. "Matter with Jay resolved. Permanently. Have ordered cellar resealed. Portrait to be burned. Ruby dismissed for gossip. Must focus on restoring accounts. Financial ruin threatens." Caldwell traced Ashford's financial records over the months following that entry and discovered that Ashford's fortune collapsed with stunning speed. By early 1852, he had sold off parcels of land, livestock, and several enslaved individuals. Letters between Ashford and his bank in downtown Charleston reveal accusations of deliberate misrepresentation and fraud. One letter from the Bank of Charleston read, "The inconsistencies across your submitted accounts extend beyond clerical error. Pattern indicates intentional manipulation. Immediate explanation required. All outstanding balances must be addressed." Whatever Ashford wrote in his response is lost to history. What remains is the rapid unraveling of the Ashford family. By the summer of 1852, he sold off the main house itself and relocated to a much smaller residence outside Somerville, rarely seen in public again. With the estate abandoned, the portrait, supposedly slated for destruction, vanished from the record, only to reappear a year later in the attic of the Pembroke house.
Caldwell might have ended his investigation there, concluding that Jonas Booker had been a brilliant enslaved man whose education inadvertently enabled him to orchestrate a financial collapse from inside the Ashford household. But something continued to pull him back to the abandoned plantation. On June 23, 1873, Caldwell recorded a final visit to the grounds before closing his research. The caretaker, an older man named Luther Briggs, allowed him to explore the property's lower levels. Beneath the main house, Caldwell found a room that did not appear in any of the estate's architectural plans, a narrow, windowless chamber, about 8 by 10 feet, positioned away from the other storerooms. The doorway had been completely sealed with old brickwork and plaster. Caldwell wrote, "The room's walls unusually thick, air dense. Doorway clearly bricked at a later date. Inside, found a narrow desk, older than the surrounding furnishings, positioned against the north wall. The desk's drawer, when opened, contained something Caldwell struggled to comprehend. Hundreds of tiny inscriptions carved directly into the wood, each line no thicker than the scratch of a fine needle. Columns of numbers, sums, figures, just like the ones Jonas kept, but without context. Intermixed were short passages in an elegant hand, reflecting a level of education far beyond what Ashford claimed to have provided. Caldwell copied several passages into his notebook. The clearest section read, "They believe the portrait holds only my likeness. The artist observed my face, but not my eyes. He did not notice that I observed him, learning his craft. With each stroke he created a door. Ashford sees a trained specimen, an ornament to parade before his guests. He does not see how the numbers speak. 3 years of watching, 3 years of calculating, 3 years of smiling. The sums are complete, adjustments irreversible. I will continue to watch from the frame as they discover what I have done." Caldwell, shaken by the implications, returned to the Charleston Heritage Society and spoke with the curator, Mrs. Harriet Duval, about displaying the portrait. She refused. Several staff members had requested the painting remain in storage, complaining that the subject's gaze made them uneasy. The curator insisted the portrait stay in its crate until further notice. Caldwell's final journal entry about Jonas reads, "The smile haunts me. Once it appeared simple, benign, even gentle, but now it seems to hold triumph, a knowing, as though he succeeded in what he began. Caldwell died in 1880, his notes donated to the South Carolina Historical Archives. The portrait remained in storage, unremarked upon for years, until 1929, when it was featured briefly in an exhibition on African American history. It lasted 3 days. Visitors complained of feeling watched. One elderly woman reported seeing that Ashford boy's smile after all these years. The portrait was removed and sealed again. In 1959, during a renovation of the archives, the painting was accidentally unpacked. Historian Paul Merriman photographed it for an academic journal, but the first set of photographs came out blurred around the eyes and mouth. A second set showed distortions in the smile. Only the third attempt produced acceptable images, though the expression still appeared subtly different from the original descriptions. The most troubling chapter in the portrait's history arrived in 1963 during a building-wide renovation that forced the temporary relocation of many artifacts. The portrait of Jonas Booker was packed in a custom wooden crate and transported by truck to a secure facility in Colombia. When the crate arrived, it was sealed, undamaged, and empty. The receiving log read, "Item number C11. Portrait of young man, oil on canvas, missing." The painting was never found, but the story wasn't over. Not even close. After the disappearance of the portrait from the sealed crate in 1963, the Charleston Heritage Society filed an insurance claim, noting the painting as lost or stolen under unknown circumstances. That might have been the end of the story, if not for what happened less than a year later at the former Ashford plantation. In April of 1964, the property, which had been bought and sold repeatedly since the Ashford family's collapse, was purchased by the Charleston Preservation Trust with plans to restore it as a museum dedicated to antebellum plantation history. The Trust's workers began clearing out debris, inspecting structural supports, and examining original foundations. During an inspection of the basement level, a construction worker noticed something odd, a hollow sound behind a plastered wall. Consulting the property's oldest architectural plans, the team discovered what Caldwell had described almost a century earlier, a sealed room that didn't appear on the official blueprints. On June 3, 1964, workers knocked through the plaster and uncovered the bricked-over doorway leading to the same narrow, windowless chamber Caldwell had documented. The Trust's official report describes the interior clinically. Room approximately 8 by 10 feet, no windows, single wooden desk present, deep discoloration on south wall, approximately in dimensions of a median-sized portrait. But that dry description omitted details that appeared in the private journal of Margaret Ellison, the Preservation Trust's lead historian. According to Ellison's handwritten notes, the desk drawer contained far more carvings than were present in Caldwell's day. The tiny inscriptions now covered every inch of the interior, the sides, the bottom, even the underside of the drawer's top. And the carvings were no longer confined to 1850s. Many referenced events that occurred long after the plantation was abandoned. Ellison documented one passage mentioning Caldwell by name, describing him photographing the forgotten things. Another entry referenced the 1929 exhibition that had briefly displayed the portrait at the Charleston Heritage Society. Still another noted Professor Merriman's failed photography attempts in 1959. But it was the final carved inscription that unsettled Ellison so deeply she refused to include it in the official report. Carved in razor-thin strokes at the bottom right corner of the drawer, it was dated March 12, 1963, the day the portrait was packed for transfer to Colombia. It read simply, "I have learned enough. It is time to leave this frame." Ellison confided in only 2 other trust members. All 3 agreed to secure the desk in off-site storage and exclude the disturbing material from public documentation. The room itself was sealed once again, though Ellison later wondered whether sealing had ever made a difference. Over the next few years, the former Ashford plantation faced mounting problems. Night watchmen resigned in unusual numbers, citing strange noises, scratching, whispering, or what one described as a soft dragging sound, like someone shifting on a wooden stool. Several reported feeling watched, especially near the sealed chamber. The trust abandoned restoration plans in late 1967, officially citing structural instability, though Ellison's private notes suggest the real reason was the staff's growing fear. The property sat vacant for 2 decades before being demolished in 1986 to make way for a small residential subdivision.
During excavations for the new subdivision, workers unearthed a rusted metal box directly beneath where the Ashford study had once stood. Inside was a single object, a folded piece of paper containing a detailed pencil sketch of a smiling young man. In the bottom corner was the simple signature J.B. The developer dismissed the drawing as unimportant and discarded it with the rest of the refuse. The subdivision, initially named Ashford Meadows in honor of the land's history, struggled with low occupancy rates despite Charleston's booming housing market. Residents who did move in complained of strange phenomena: unexplained sounds at night, shifting reflections in windows, and an uncanny sensation of being observed in their own homes. After property values steadily declined, the community was renamed Riverbend Estates in 1992 to distance it from its troubled past. The story might have faded entirely if not for a discovery in 2001 during renovations at an old Charleston banking building that once housed the Merchants and Trades Bank, where the Ashfords had kept their accounts. Workers found a narrow hidden compartment behind what was once the bank manager's desk. Inside it lay a leather folio containing dozens of pages of financial records dated between 1848 and 1851. The handwriting was meticulous, far more elegant and precise than typical clerks of the era. Forensic accountants who reviewed the documents found a sophisticated pattern of deliberate incremental adjustments, tiny alterations in transaction sums, subtle modifications to account balances, and minuscule rounding discrepancies. Individually undetectable, collectively they amounted to substantial transfers of funds, money being siphoned quietly from the Ashford accounts to several anonymous holding accounts. The final entry, dated August 13, 1851, the day before Ashford claimed Jonas had escaped, contained a short notation: calculations complete, balance corrected, freedom acquired. But no records exist showing Jonas Booker ever purchasing his freedom, nor is there any trace of a free man matching his description living in the Low Country during the years following his supposed escape. The accounts he redirected funds into appeared under names that were never matched to any individuals. Historians proposed several interpretations. Perhaps Jonas fled north under a new identity. Perhaps his financial sabotage was discovered and Ashford ensured he never left the cellar alive. But one unsettling detail remained. The handwriting in the bank ledgers matched the carvings in the desk drawer. And then there was the art. In 1997, art historian Dr. Melinda Harper published a paper examining portraiture from Charleston and Savannah between 1845 and 1865. Among her observations was something odd: an unidentified young black man appearing in the background of several paintings by R.T. Harrow, a Charleston portrait artist active during that period. The man appeared not as a subject, but as a background figure,
looking through a window, standing among servants in a family portrait, or walking among a distant crowd. His face, though tiny, matched the descriptions of Jonas Booker, and in every painting, he was smiling. Harrow's journals contained no mention of using the same model, yet the same face appeared in at least 6 of his works completed after 1851, the year Jonas's portrait was painted. Harrow abruptly stopped painting in 1663 and was admitted to a sanitarium outside Columbia, where he spent the last years of his life claiming someone watched him through the frames. He refused to look at mirrors or paintings of any kind. By then, researchers had begun calling the recurring figure by a single name, the Smiling Boy. And he was not done yet.
The mystery of the recurring figure might have remained a footnote in academic journals if not for what happened at the Charleston Museum archives in 2004. During an extensive digitization project, a staff member sorting through misplaced daguerreotypes discovered an unlabeled image stored among unrelated materials. The photograph, estimated to date from around 1852 based on its technical features, showed the interior of a painter's studio, the unfinished canvases, the tall windows, the clutter of brushes and oils, suggesting a working artist rather than a staged photograph. Seated at an easel, his back turned toward the camera, was a man who could not be identified. But what drew immediate attention was the portrait on the easel. It was unmistakably a plantation family scene, and in the background, barely visible in the far right corner, was the face of a young black man watching from the edge of a field, smiling faintly. When researchers compared the unfinished canvas in the daguerreotype to the finished painting, which now hangs in a private collection in Charleston, they confirmed that the figure was indeed present in both. The artist had painted him deliberately. But the most disturbing element of the daguerreotype wasn't the figure in the painting. It was a faded inscription on the back of the photograph. Barely readable, even after digital enhancement, it seemed to say, "He watches as I work. Not I him, but he me." The discovery reignited academic debate, prompting scholars to revisit every known painting by R.T. Harrow. Using advanced imaging techniques, experts uncovered something even stranger. In each painting where the smiling figure appeared, infrared scans revealed that portions of the canvas had been repainted, specifically around the eyes and mouths of the main white subjects. In earlier layers, before the modifications, the subjects appeared composed, dignified, and expressionless. But in later layers, the ones visible to the human eye, each expression had softened into something else: vulnerability, fear, even guilt. Every modification was subtle but consistent, as though someone had revisited the paintings and changed them. Dr. Harper expanded her research after discovering these anomalies and proposed a theory that sent shockwaves through art history circles. What if Jonas Booker had received artistic training from Harrow himself? A recently discovered letter from a plantation owner to Harrow suggested that Ashford's experiment with educating Jonas may have included instruction in drawing or portrait techniques. The letter, dated 1849, read, "Your assessment of the boy's natural eye for form intrigues me. If his potential continues, the results could prove most interesting indeed."
For Harper, this opened an entirely new dimension to the case. If Jonas learned to paint, even partially, he might have been capable of modifying paintings himself long after their creation. But such a possibility required suspending all conventional understanding of art preservation, paint chemistry, and even physical limitations. And then came the sketchbook. In 2009, the Telfair Museums in Savannah received an anonymous package containing a weathered, leather-bound sketchbook. The note attached said only, found among my grandfather's belongings, might be relevant to the JB matter. On the back cover of the sketchbook, faint but unmistakable, were the initials JB pressed into the leather. Inside were dozens of pencil drawings, faces, expressions, gestures, each rendered with uncanny precision. Several sketches resembled the young man from the missing portrait, unmistakable in the curve of the smile and the downward tilt of the eyes. Other pages showed studies of the Ashford family and their guests, but drawn not as formal portraits, rather as private, unguarded moments. A woman arguing behind a closed door, Ashford himself reading late at night, a guest anxiously counting coins in his palm. Every sketch carried a date, a time, and a note describing the subject's habits. The entries read more like surveillance logs than artistic practice. But the final pages of the sketchbook were the most unsettling. They contained detailed studies of human eyes, drawn repeatedly with slight variations, some flat, some deep, some following the viewer no matter how the page was turned. Beneath these eye studies, written in careful script, was a cryptic line: "A portrait is not a prison unless the artist paints it that way. A frame can be a door." Around this time, rumors began circulating among museum conservators about a peculiar phenomenon: tiny inscriptions, no longer than a quarter-inch, appearing on the back of antebellum paintings. Each inscription contained a date and two initials, JB. Some dates were from the 1850s, others were from the 1920s, 1940s, 1970s. One was from 2006. And then the reports began. In 2012, a visiting professor specializing in early American art claimed she saw a figure in the background of a painting at the Charleston Museum, a figure she insisted had not been there when she studied the same painting years earlier. The man's face was partially visible through a window behind the main subject, and though small, the smile was unmistakable. When museum staff examined the painting minutes later, the background showed only the original scene with no figure present. Similar accounts emerged in Louisiana, Virginia, and North Carolina. Museum goers described catching glimpses of a face in a painting's reflection or appearing briefly over a subject's shoulder, only to vanish upon second glance. The descriptions were nearly identical: a young black man, a slight tilt to the head, a knowing smile, eyes that seemed to watch. Art conservators began reporting something stranger still: freshly dried varnish in places that had not been touched in decades, pigment shifts inconsistent with natural aging, background shadows that seemed to move between documented condition reports. But the most disturbing testimony came from a private collector in 2016 who owned one of Harrow's plantation portraits. She reported waking one night to find the portrait on the floor, leaning against the wall, face inward. When she lifted it, she found a tiny inscription in the fresh dust: "Still watching." By now, the figure had a new name among researchers: the Charleston Smiler. But others, less formal, less academic, called him something else entirely: the boy who never left the frame. And still, the story deepened.
The reappearance of the initials JB on paintings across the South prompted a wave of new research into the Ashford plantation records, though most had long since been scattered across libraries, archives, or private collections. In 2019, a graduate researcher named Daniel Serrano, working through the Charleston City Archives, uncovered an obscure property deed dated January 1857, almost 6 years after Jonas Booker had supposedly escaped, died, or vanished.
The deed recorded the purchase of a small parcel of land on the outskirts of Charleston by an individual identified only as J. Bennett, free man of color. The signature on the deed, though stylized differently, bore the same distinct handwriting present in the Ashford ledgers and the sketches found in the leather-bound book. The parcel of land was curious for more than just its mysterious buyer. It sat on an elevated patch overlooking the old Ashford property, with a clear line of sight to the main house, almost as though the buyer wanted to keep watch. Survey records suggested the land was intended for a modest dwelling and studio space, yet no structure was ever built. The land remained owned by J. Bennett until 1863, when it reverted to the city for unpaid taxes. No record of a man named Bennett living in the area could be found, nor any record of his death or departure. Serrano noted in his research that all other owners of that surname during the period were accounted for. This left one possibility scholars found difficult to dismiss. J. Bennett might have been an alias, one chosen by Jonas Booker. Still, the question remained, if Jonas acquired enough funds for freedom, why remain so close to the plantation that had enslaved him? Why linger within sight of the very house that imprisoned him? The answers only grew stranger with each new discovery. In 2020, a document restoration project at the South Carolina State Archives uncovered a series of letters written by R.T. Harrow, the portrait artist linked to several paintings containing Jonas's supposed likeness. One letter, dated October 1852, months after Jonas's disappearance, was addressed to Harrow's sister in Columbia. Its contents shocked historians.
Each time I return to my canvases, I sense a presence. Not in the room. No, I would know that, but in the paintings themselves. As though the eyes within them shift when I look away. I paint a man and find his gaze altered the next morning. His madness, I know. Yet I swear I saw Jonas standing behind me in the studio mirror, though I was alone. Another letter, written weeks before Harrow abruptly abandoned his work and entered a sanitarium, said, "He sits for one portrait and now insists on sitting for all the others, though I no longer invite him. He smiles even when I attempt to paint him out. I fear I've created something I do not understand." Such letters were quickly dismissed by many as evidence of a deteriorating mind, until another discovery forced a reevaluation. During a 2021 renovation of the historic Harrison Boyd House in downtown Charleston, a contractor found a loose brick behind a fireplace mantel. Behind it, almost impossibly preserved, was a small envelope addressed simply to whoever finds this. Inside was a sheet of paper that appeared to be a fragment of a diary belonging to an unnamed painter, possibly Harrow himself. The boy has learned to step from one frame to another. Not physically, no, that is impossible, but in the eyes. They follow, they adjust, they rewrite. I no longer paint him, he paints himself. The authenticity of the fragment has been debated, but handwriting experts found strong similarities between the script and Harrow's confirmed letters. The academic community could not agree on how to interpret any of this until something happened that brought the myth into the present day. In early 2021, a staff member at the Charleston Heritage Society reported a disturbing night shift incident. While conducting routine rounds, he noticed the storage room door slightly ajar. Inside, leaning against the inner wall, was a framed portrait, a painting no one remembered cataloging. It depicted a young black man in 19th century clothing, smiling faintly. The style resembled Harrow's, but the subject's eyes were sharper, more alert, as though locked directly on the guard. When he called for the archivist to examine it, the painting had vanished. No inventory logs listed such a portrait. No painting matching the description existed in any Charleston museum. Yet the guard insisted he had seen it. and that it looked exactly like the sketches of Jonas Booker found years earlier. His written incident report concluded with a line later mocked by colleagues, but never retracted by him. He wasn't painted into the room. He was standing in it. At first, the story was dismissed as a hallucination or a prank, but the guard had no history of such episodes, and his account remained consistent under repeated questioning. Then came an incident far harder to dismiss. In 2023, a curator from the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, on loan for a collaborative exhibition with Charleston, reported seeing a faint reflection in the glass protecting an antebellum portrait. Behind the main subject, barely visible in the reflection, but not in the painting itself, she saw the unmistakable smile of a young man watching her. When she turned around, the gallery was empty. The next day, she returned with colleagues to prove she hadn't imagined it. The reflection was gone. But when high-resolution photographs of the painting were compared to older documentation, small differences emerged. The background shadows had shifted. The angle of light on the wooden floor had changed. And something, a faint outline behind a distant window, appeared where before there was nothing. The museum dismissed the anomalies as lighting distortions or camera inconsistencies, but the curator, visibly shaken, noted, "The reflection didn't show the room behind me. It showed what the painting wanted me to see." Meanwhile, in Charleston, rumors spread quietly among museum security, archivists, and restorers. They spoke of faint scratching sounds behind storage doors, as though someone were carving into wood. They spoke of frames found slightly moved, angled not outward but inward, as though observing the room. They spoke of a whisper of movement in galleries after hours, a shift of shadow, a change in reflection, a momentary glimpse of a smile. And increasingly, they spoke of a realization no one wanted to say plainly. If Jonas Booker learned to move through numbers, ledgers, art, and observation, perhaps the portrait was never a prison. Perhaps it was only the first doorway, and he had found many others since. By 2024, the legend of Jonas Booker no longer lived only in archived letters or forgotten ledgers. It began surfacing in quiet conversations among museum staff, conservators, archivists, and graduate researchers, people trained to trust evidence, not folklore. Yet these same professionals found themselves whispering about a figure who appeared where he should not exist, in works where he had not been painted, at times when the galleries were empty. One of the most unsettling incidents occurred in March of that year when the Charleston Museum hosted a private after-hours reception for donors. While staff prepared the galleries, an intern named Lydia Carrington was assigned to adjust lighting around the antebellum portrait section. As she moved a stepladder near a large Harrow painting, a plantation scene from 1854, she froze. The painting, long known for its static depiction of a family on a veranda, seemed subtly changed. The faint outline of a figure stood between two oak trees in the far background. Just a shadow at first. But when Carrington stepped closer, squinting, she felt a chill rise along her arms. The shadow had a face, and it was smiling. She backed away, convinced her mind was playing tricks. She fetched a colleague, but by the time they returned, the distant figure had vanished. Yet Carrington insisted she had seen him, the same young man whose sketches had appeared in the lost notebook, whose eyes followed viewers in the missing portrait, whose initials kept appearing on canvases. Carrington left her internship 2 weeks later. In her exit interview, she described the moment with striking clarity. It wasn't the smile, it was the eyes. They weren't painted, they were looking. Museum leadership attributed the episode to stress, but staff uneasily noted her description matched accounts spanning more than a century. It didn't end there. In May, an independent art conservator named Reese Halston was hired to evaluate a set of Harrow paintings owned by a private collector in Mount Pleasant. During his inspection, Halston noticed something alarming. Paint layers that should have been hardened for over a century felt faintly warm to the touch, as though freshly applied. One painting, a portrait of a Charleston merchant, had distinct microscopic fissures around the eyes, cracks that did not match the rest of the painting's natural aging pattern. They looked newer, too new. Even stranger, imaging tests revealed ghostly remnants of an earlier composition beneath the visible surface. In the underlayer, the merchant's expression was calm, his gaze directed toward the viewer. But in the uppermost layer, the layer painted last, the man's eyes looked away, shifted toward the painting's far background, toward a window that opened onto a hazy landscape.
Halston zoomed in on the landscape, adjusting contrasts and filters. There, barely visible, were the faintest traces of a face, the beginnings of a smile. It was so subtle that most would miss it, but Halston felt certain. Someone had altered the painting long after Harrow created it. The collector dismissed the theory as impossible, refusing further testing. Halston, in his report, wrote a line that echoed Harrow's own deteriorating notes. Someone has been inside the painting since its creation. Then, in June 2024, something occurred that museum professionals still refuse to discuss publicly. The Charleston Heritage Society was conducting its annual midnight inventory, a quiet ritual where staff checked temperature controls, examined artworks for any signs of damage, and updated digital logs. Two senior archivists, Morven Falk and Elena Rivers, entered the secure vault where the society stored its most fragile items. Among them were Caldwell's journals, Ashford's surviving ledgers, and the empty crate that once held Jonas Booker's vanished portrait. The crate, long emptied and treated almost as a grim artifact in itself, stood against the far wall. Falk documented its condition every year. Same cracked edges, same faded label, same silence when tapped. But that night, something was different. As Falk approached the crate with her clipboard, she heard a faint sound. Not the shuffle of papers or settling wood, something softer, almost like a slow, deliberate exhale. She froze. Rivers, seeing her colleague hesitate, stepped closer and gently placed her ear against the side of the crate. Her breath caught. She jerked back so violently she knocked over a stack of binders. Falk whispered, "What did you hear?" Rivers shook her head. It sounded like Falk pressed her own ear to the crate. There it was, a soft creaking, a shift of weight. And beneath that, something disturbingly human. A faint, subtle sound, the barely audible curve of breath that accompanies a smile. Both women backed away slowly, neither willing to turn her back. They locked the room and left without finishing the inventory. The next morning, the crate was inspected by 3 staff members. Nothing was inside, no sign of disturbance. But when Falk retrieved the previous night's audio logs from the vault corridor, she found a 15-second stretch of static, followed by a sound not heard in the room itself. An unmistakable whisper of pencil against paper, as though someone were writing. The archivists agreed never to discuss the incident publicly. But privately, they wondered, if Jonas Booker had discovered how to move beyond his portrait, where was he now? Not all reports came from experts. In July 2024, an elderly couple visiting from Virginia stopped mid-tour in one of Charleston's small historical galleries. The woman claimed she saw a young black man in old-fashioned clothing reflected in a beveled glass display case. He stood behind her husband, smiling. But when she turned around, no one was there.
A week later, a high school tour group reported seeing a man in old clothes watching them from the end of a hallway. Staff members dismissed it as a prank, but security footage showed something entirely different. The children turning, startled, toward an empty corridor just seconds before one student fainted. And then came the journal. In October 2024, a local historian working in a secondhand bookstore in Charleston found a leather notebook tucked between two stacks of vintage sheet music. The notebook had no cover, no inscription, only worn pages. Inside, however, were entries written in the same elegant script found in the desk drawer at the Ashford site. The entries were dated sporadically, spanning more than a century. Some appeared in 1851, some in 1928. One was dated 1963, the day the portrait vanished from its sealed crate. The final entry was dated September 2024. It read, "They continue to observe, thinking themselves the watchers. But every gallery becomes an opening. Every canvas becomes a window. Every eye, a reflection." Beneath that, a small symbol appeared, a roughly sketched smile, and the initials, J.B. It was the first new writing attributed to Jonas Booker in more than 60 years. But it would not be the last.
By late 2024, the name Jonas Booker had quietly resurfaced in academic circles, though never in official publications. No historian wanted to risk their reputation by suggesting that an enslaved man from the mid-1800s had somehow transcended his portrait, or worse, learned to move between them. And yet, the incidents continued. In early November, a graduate student at the University of South Carolina, Naomi Crittenden, was examining a series of digitized plantation ledgers from the late 1840s for her thesis. As she zoomed into one ledger, one that had already been scanned and certified twice before, she noticed something she was certain had not been present in earlier images: a small margin note written in the unmistakably fine script identified as Jonas Booker's handwriting. It read, "You are reading what I left. I am reading what you write." The note vanished from the scan the following week. When Naomi rechecked the original microfilm, the margin was blank. Meanwhile, at the Charleston Heritage Society, security staff reported an anomaly during their nightly rounds. At precisely 2:13 a.m., one guard walking past the closed research room heard the rapid scratch of a pencil. When he opened the door, the lights were off. The room was empty except for a single sheet of archival paper lying on the table. On it was a crude pencil sketch of the research room itself, drawn from an angle high in the corner, as though observed from above. The sketch included the guard frozen mid-step, his hand on the doorknob. Beneath the drawing was a single word, "Noted." Despite an internal investigation, no explanation was found. The guard resigned 2 days later. In December, a low-level archivist in Columbia, reviewing 19th-century Charleston business correspondence, found a brief letter that made her stop breathing. The letter was dated October 1851 and addressed to an unknown recipient. It was short, written in elegant, deliberate strokes. "I leave this body of paper behind as one leaves a host. The frame served its purpose. There are other frames now." There was no signature, only two initials etched faintly into the corner. J.B. This phrasing echoed something written long ago in the desk drawer carvings from the old Ashford cellar. The artist created not a prison, but a window. It echoed the 1963 drawer carving, "It is time to leave this frame." And it echoed the reflection glimpses reported across museums from Georgia to Virginia. By now, the emerging whispered hypothesis among a handful of scholars was this: Jonas Booker might not have left the world, only the medium through which the world first tried to contain him.
He learned the logic of ledgers and numbers. He learned the structure of art and portraits. He learned how observation itself could become a doorway. And then perhaps he stepped through. Every new discovery made this theory more difficult to dismiss. In early 2025, a conservator at a small Mount Pleasant gallery reported something that shook even the skeptics. He had been restoring a minor plantation portrait, a little-known unsigned piece depicting a family dining on a veranda, when he felt compelled to examine the background under infrared. Beneath the layers of paint and varnish, faint but unmistakable, was the preliminary sketch of a young man watching the family from a distance. The face matched the known sketches of Jonas. But the version of the painting visible to the naked eye, no such figure appeared. The conservator realized, not for the first time, that the painting seemed subtly altered each time he photographed it. The smile in the shadows would appear, then vanish. The eyes from the windows would shift. In his report, he added a final line. Someone is painting from the other side of the canvas. But even this was not the most chilling revelation. In late 2025, an incident occurred at a private home in Charleston's historic district. The homeowner, a lawyer with no interest in the paranormal, purchased a small 19th century painting from an estate sale in Richmond. The painting, a simple riverside scene, appeared completely ordinary, no human figures, no portraits. Yet within a week of displaying it on her wall, she began to feel uneasy around the artwork. The room felt watched. One evening, while hosting a small dinner gathering, a guest asked, "Who's the young man in the background?" Confused, the homeowner approached the painting. The far left corner of the riverside scene, previously empty, now showed the faint outline of a man standing among the reeds. A slight smile marked his face. When she checked the painting the next morning, the figure was gone. But something new had appeared on the back of the canvas, faint, written in pencil. "I still listen." The homeowner returned the painting the next day. More reports followed, each stranger than the last. A museum in Savannah documented a nearly imperceptible shift in a portrait's background after the gallery lights flickered. A young couple in New Orleans reported a figure appearing only in the reflections of glass-covered paintings, but not in the paintings themselves.
A historian researching plantation archives in Petersburg opened a volume that had been untouched since 1938 and found a fresh page inserted inside. It contained a sketch of herself, seated at her desk, drawn from a point of view impossible for anyone in the room to have recorded. In each case, the same signature appeared: J.B. But the most unsettling account came from a night guard at the Georgia Historical Society, echoing a similar statement recorded decades earlier. In his log, dated October 28, 2025, he wrote, "Saw that portrait again, not hanging, leaning against the inside of the storage room door. Same boy, same smile. He looks finished with something, satisfied, as if he knows he won't be seen again, not because he's gone, but because he no longer needs the portrait." 2 days later, he added a final line: "I don't think he's in the frames anymore." And that is where the record ends. Yet across Charleston, Richmond, Baton Rouge, Savannah, and beyond, visitors continue to report a quiet, inexplicable feeling in old galleries, particularly near antebellum portraits. A sense not merely of being watched, but being studied, calculated, noted. Some swear they see a faint smile from the corner of their eye. Others insist that a figure sometimes appears where none should be, always in the background, always observing. And a few, the ones who linger too long,
who stare too deeply into the painted eyes of long-dead subjects, report something else entirely. A sudden awareness that someone, somewhere, is looking back, recording them, adding them to the ledger of a mind that has never stopped calculating. A mind once trapped behind a smile forced by a cruel hand, a mind that discovered that a portrait frame is not a prison, but a doorway. A doorway Jonas Booker stepped through long ago, and perhaps still does. Still watching, still noting, still smiling.